Hey guys, what's going on? Jacob here. So now we know how to create web pages in HTML and how to style them with CSS. Now it's time to add some dynamic content, and we do that with PHP. Anything that pulls data from a database in one way or another uses PHP. But unlike HTML and CSS, it does take a bit more work to learn. That's because it's an actual programming language. So let's get started. PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Processor. Great name, I know. As I mentioned before, PHP is a programming language, and it's one of the most common programming languages used on the web. WordPress, which I almost exclusively use, and other content management systems use PHP. It sits on the server side, so it's our connection between the client, or the viewer of our website, and our database. So it's the perfect language to get the data from the database and put it out on the page. Before we start talking about PHP, there are a few things we need to talk through first. First, you're going to need a local server to run PHP. I talked about XAMPP and other similar products in an earlier video, so make sure you have those set up before beginning. Next, we need to talk about syntax. You'll find this out pretty quickly, but PHP is pretty strict on using the correct syntax. In order for PHP to run, it must be surrounded by this, and each PHP statement must have a semicolon at the end. Otherwise, you're going to get the dreaded syntax error. Finally, we can mix HTML and PHP together. In fact, PHP was written to work with HTML. So technically you can place any PHP code inside of an HTML file. The only thing you need to do is change the file type from HTML to PHP. So now that we've worked through some of those basics, let's actually print something on the page. The typical test when first starting a programming language is printing out hello world. So let's do that. So let's turn our HTML file from earlier into a PHP file. Reduce all the HTML down into H1 element, and then inside the element, place this line of code. Before we go on and see how it looks on the page, I do want to say that Echo will print strings and numbers out onto the page. If you're wanting to print out an array to test something, you're going to use print_r. But we'll get to the arrays and all that later. Anyway, now you can go to your index.php file and see this on the page. We're off to a good start. Variables in programming languages are used to store data to be used and changed throughout the program. In PHP, you can define a variable like this. There are, however, a couple of rules on how you define a variable in PHP. First, it starts with a $sign and then some sort of text. The name after the $sign must start with an underscore or a letter. Never numbers. After that though, it can contain numbers, underscores, or letters. And variables are also case sensitive, so these two variables are not the same. You can echo variables just the same way we did with hello world earlier, and you can add, subtract, multiply, divide, and do other operations with the variables. But we'll get to that at the end. On this same note, you can also define constants in PHP. These are like variables, but they won't change in the program no matter what you do. So to define a constant, we'll run the define function with our constant name, what the value of the constant will be, and whether it will be case sensitive or not. And then in our code, we can call the constant by its name. While we're on the topic of variables, let's talk about data types. Variables in PHP can store different types of data, and each type of data does different things. The data types we'll go over today are strings, integers, floats, booleans, arrays, and objects. Strings are the most common data type because they're simply text. Anything inside single or double quotes is a string. So our hello world text from earlier was a string. Combine two strings by placing a period between the two strings or two variables containing strings. This is known as concatenation. Integers are the next most common data type. Integers are any non-decimal number, so 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And it can be either positive or negative. Finally, it can be decimal, base 10, hexadecimal, base 16, or octal, base 8. We'll talk more about how you can manipulate integers at the end of the video. Floats are numbers with decimals or that are in scientific or exponential form. They are also known in the programming world as doubles, and they behave fairly similar to integers. A Boolean data type is either true or false. That's it. They're most commonly used with conditionals, which we'll go over next time. Arrays are the most popular way of storing multiple values inside a single variable. You can create an array like this, and you can pull out a single value by calling the variable and then putting the index for that value inside the brackets. Do note that array indices start at 0 and not 1. You can also create associative arrays like this. Associative arrays are similar to normal arrays except that you can name the indices whatever you want, which makes it easier to call them later on. An object stores multiple amounts of data and ways to handle that data. You can create an object by first creating a class. Inside the class you can define the variables or properties that will be used in the class, as well as the functions that an object in the class can use. Then to create an object, you define a variable, you use new, and the class name. And now that variable is the object. Objects are a very complicated but also very valuable part of PHP development, and we'll talk more about them in a later video. Finally, let's talk about operators, or things that will help you to manipulate data. On the arithmetic side of things, they're about the same as you've always known them to be, except that 2 star characters are used for exponents and the percentage sign is used to get the remainder when dividing 2 numbers. Next, we have the assignment operators. Obviously, the equal sign means that the left side is set to whatever the value of the right side is. Plus equal means that the value of the left side is added to the value of the right side, and then that value is assigned to the left side. Minus equal does the same thing, except the 2 values are subtracted. Star equal does multiplication, slash equal does division, and percentage equal does remainder. Also with strings, period equal adds the right string behind the left string and then assigns the new string to the left side. You can also add one or subtract one to a variable using plus plus or minus minus. Putting the signs before the variable means that the increment or decrement will happen before the value is returned. Putting the operators after will make the change happen after the variable is returned. Next, we have logical operators, which are used with conditionals, which we'll talk about next time. And returns true if all of the statements are true, or returns true if one of the statements is true. XOR returns true if one of the statements is true, but not all. And not, or the exclamation point, returns true if all of the statements are false. And finally, we have comparison operators, which we'll also use for loops and conditionals next time. For the most part, they're the same as the ones you've already known, but with a few differences. First, you need 2 equal signs to see if the 2 sides are equal, and an exclamation point and equal sign to see if they're not equal. A greater than sign and an equal sign are needed to see if something is greater than or equal to something, and a less than sign and an equal to sign are needed to see if something is less than or equal to something else. And finally, 3 equal signs will return true if the 2 sides are equal and both have the same data type. So string 2 and integer 2 would return false. The opposite of this is 1 exclamation point and 2 equal signs. Well, that's all for today. Next time we'll talk about conditionals and loops. In the meantime, do you have any questions about what we went over today? If so, leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, good luck and happy coding.